Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So, when the proverbial water recedes and the weather breaks, what will be left of cities like Chicago and New York and so many other big cities around the country as well that don't have the inclement weather during the winter to deal with, but have the same destruction wrought by, I would argue, almost exclusively the policy choices that were made in response to the pandemic? Thinking about big systems that very few people are using at present, as we've discussed. In Chicago, it's Metro and the L, but it's public transportation in big cities around the country. The expense, the number of people employed by those big systems. How do big cities recover, right size, reimagine themselves after all that has been wrought and will have been wrought by the other side of the pandemic when herd immunity is achieved, perhaps this summer? For some help in thinking about that, pleased to be joined again by Chuck Marohn. He's the founder and president of strongtowns.org and the author of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. Chuck, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, I mean, you've done such, and your organization has done such interesting work over many years thinking about how cities and towns operate at the local level, the way they use scarce resources, the investments they make, the gambits they take. I mean, this is really a watershed moment, perhaps, in American history for big city America. And so I assume you've been doing a lot of thinking about things like mass transit in places like Chicago and New York and LA and what that looks like coming out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Going into this pandemic, our cities were very fragile financially. There's a lot of dynamism in our cities. There's a lot going on. And I think when we look at, people and entrepreneurship and business creation and everything that we value about cities, a lot of that was very active, but it was active on this chassis of insolvency. We were having difficulty running our transit systems prior to the pandemic. We were having difficulty maintaining our streets prior to the pandemic. In Illinois, your financial state, not only of the city, but of the state itself, is a complete basket case. This is giving you no fallback position. You in a sense are wholly dependent now on kind of the whims of the bond market and the good graces of whatever federal bailout may come your way. That's a pretty tenuous way to live. And so, the pandemic and its impacts financially on cities has been huge. And I think the long-term consequences of shifts in living patterns, shifts in preferability, these are unknowns, but they're unknowns that I think pose huge challenges to cities that don't have a lot of capacity to adapt right now.
So if you're a city planner or you're advising a big city mayor and you're saying you see, for example, 20% of Manhattan disappear over the last 6 months, and perhaps no indication that many of those people will be coming back. And obviously the same flight has been happening places like Chicago and LA too, which is why all three of those states are going to lose members of Congress after this census. What are you advising them? What are you saying? Here's at least what we need to think about. What are we going to do about big transit systems? What are we going to do about maintenance of infrastructure? What are we going to do about the level of property taxation and, by contrast, the spending on schools, regardless of how they're sort of differently organized in some of the big cities? What are we going to do about unfunded pension liabilities, which is a problem throughout big city America and, frankly, a lot of small town America, too? How do you start getting people to confront this sort of new fiscal reality that they had put off this long? And maybe they'll be able to put off a little bit longer with sort of funny money from the feds, but not much beyond that.
Right. I think this is, there's really, in terms of advice, maybe advice should, the advice was decades ago. Now it's just dealing with the consequences, right? There's a sense of, austerity is always talked about as well. We shouldn't do austerity because it's bad for growth or it's bad for the economy. Austerity is generally not a choice. Austerity is a consequence of past actions. And in a lot of ways, yes, we have some places we can invest and some places that we should be, disinvesting from. And we have some policies that we should change and things we should do differently. But the reality is that a lot of this is going to be forced on us. Resolving the pension crisis is going to be forced upon us. There's not it's not like we have an option to deal with this or not. We're going to have to. Cities, I'm not worried about Chicago and, Manhattan losing population. There's enough people that want to live in these places. But I think the change will be the kind of population, right? Both of these cities, Chicago has floated on, kind of this froth of financialization and affluence. And a lot of those people have decamped, for tax reasons, for quality of life reasons, for what they perceive as their health or safety reasons. There's a lot of people who will backfill those, but they will be people who are poorer. There'll be people who, are less part of that transaction economy.
Right.
And in some ways that might be good. I feel like, the big problem our cities have is not a lack of access to capital, but sometimes like crazy capital in ways. But it's also going to be tough because it's going to force us to confront a lot of these insolvencies that we've just been able to paper over.
And don't you think a lot of families are going to be moving out? I know 5 families on our street that moved already strictly because of CPS. And they're sick of these strikes and sick of all, these e-learning forever experiences that we're having.
Yeah, I feel like for you all in particular, there's a public school situation that needs to be figured out. Here in Minnesota, where I'm from, we have a long history of great public education and really valuing it. But we also, I think, culturally have some expectations that, when we prioritize teachers for vaccination, that means we need to get back to work, like we need to get kids back in schools. When we're all sacrificing together, including the people working at the grocery stores that we've called essential workers and the people working in the gas stations that we've called essential workers, getting these kids back in school where they can start learning again, those are essential services. That's an essential worker. Let's do that. The dysfunction you have there is a little bit beyond my capacity to understand, but certainly it's something that needs to be resolved and be resolved urgently.
It is beyond most rational people's capacity to understand, so don't feel like you're alone. Okay. With respect to the areas that, as you say, now we're in the period of dealing with the consequences. We're not really in a position of being strategic thinkers other than in dealing with the consequences. So, for example, these big cities, they're going to have to confront the reality that their head count at the city level, at the school district level, is too high. The personnel costs are too high, and they're going to need to shrink the personnel costs and, frankly, by inference, the number of people who work in city and county and school district government. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think cities in general are going to have to tighten up their ship. And I think I hate to use like these buzzwords because, they've been used for decades, but, in sense of reimagining local government as something that is less hierarchical and less, silos and hierarchies and kind of a U.S. military model of operation. We have different departments. I think we're going to have to really start focusing on geographic teams. How do we serve neighborhoods? How do we get down to the block level? And how do we do that with a staff that is quite frankly leaner and more agile?
So just to make that concrete, so you're talking about things like, there's 10 communities that are adjacent to one another in a county. Not all 10 of them need a public library. You can share 1 or 2 public libraries. Not all 10 of them need a public swimming pool. Things like this. Not all 10 of them need their own fire department and department staff. Is that what you mean when you talk about regional sharing?
In some ways, but let's we can focus on the library thing for a second. I think libraries are really important, and in fact, in my neighborhood, we have like 4 libraries, but they're the small little They're small little libraries. They're not the $50 million thing that you build. I think what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to figure out how to provide these services in a lighter way, in a lighter touch. A library is a really important thing because we can get people access to information, access to literature. Libraries are ways people grow their way out of poverty and into prosperity. How do we make those things happen on a more distributed, lower cost kind of scale, as opposed to, how does everybody get the $50 million library with the big parking lot and underground parking facilities and all that, which is how we tend to approach these things.
Well, the problem is, I mean, it's just sort of like this is like public choice theory 101. The problem is this is how it should happen, but the incentives are to build Taj Mahals.
Yeah, well, and the incentives largely come from this fact that we can access capital. I mean, that when I say frothy, you're really looking at a state in Illinois that is completely insolvent. I mean, your bond rating is horrible. The state pays their debts in IOUs. The idea that the state or the city, which is in a similar position, would be investing in these large kind of build it and they will come transformative projects. I get the theory and I get, what people are hoping to do, but we have a long track record of that not working, not paying off. It's a little bit like, the big company that is insolvent and you go in and you say, well, we're going to launch 3 new product lines. No, you know what we're going to do? We're going to tighten up the ship. We're going to look at what we do. We're going to figure out how to do it better. And we're going to figure out how to do it with fewer people, and we're going to focus on the core services that we need to provide and do those exceptionally well. That's what cities need to do right now.
And again, cornerstones of strong towns, strong K through 12 systems. That's what attracts families. Strong healthcare infrastructure, strong infrastructure in terms of transportation, which was always the calling card for example, Chicago, the Midwest, or New York on the Eastern Seaboard, L.A. on the West Coast, and how that is perhaps how the grandiose visions of what those systems were going to look like once upon a time also need to be recast.
There's no doubt, and I think right now today there's big talk of places like Austin and Miami as being the places now that are on the receiving end of people. You said in that comment, that question, this is how we attract people. I think for Chicago, and I feel like for, Minneapolis, from my hometown here in central Minnesota, the idea needs to be less about what do we do to make ourselves attractive to people who aren't here now, and instead be what do we do to actually serve the people that are here in front of us, that are paying the taxes. What do we do to make their lives better and easier and more functional? And I think if we focus more on that, if that was our obsession, we actually find people wanting to move to our place. Like, it wouldn't be a problem attracting people. We just, I think get too obsessed with the flow, in a sense. Like, oh, these people moving to Miami, how do we get them back? Well, that's the wrong question. How do we take care of what we've got? That's really should be the obsession right now.
Chuck Marohn, founder and president of StrongTowns.org, author of Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. Chuck, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Really appreciate it. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.